Do you want more success, more growth, more results? Then it's time for the Boundless Success Accelerator from the Modern Observer Group. This isn't your average coaching program. It's where top performers come to dominate. Weekly group sessions, on-demand coaching, a community that's got your back, and a power-packed library of tools to supercharge your business and career. No more excuses, no more waiting. Get in, level up, and start building the life you've been dreaming about. Visit us at modernobserver.com/boundlesssuccess to join today. Let's get you to the next level. Hello, and welcome to the Success Showcase, the podcast that helps you succeed in your business, career, and life. I'm your host, Eric Lopkin, with the Modern Observer Group, and with me, as always, is Chip Janiszewski from the Happiness and Success GPS. Chip, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing great. How about you, Eric?
Doing fantastic. We are in the Northeast, and we're sort of hopscotching over spring a little bit. We went from cold right to hot. Right now it's like early summer weather, and we've got storms coming in the Northeast and really chaotic weather all across the country. I was talking to a friend of mine in Dallas. They're in the middle of tornado season. So for all of our listeners all over, stay safe.
Yeah, absolutely. But it is beautiful outside, minus the sunshine, but it's really nice looking up with all the leaves and everything else out there. So basically, I mean, mindset's a big thing. I'm sure that's a lot of what you're going to talk about too, Yarona. And basically, you just got to make your own sunshine, and it's your choice. So.
Yes, and speaking of sunshine, we have a sunshiny guest today. We are it is our pleasure to welcome Yarona Boster. Yarona is a speaking coach, and why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a human. That's first. I figured we should say that just in case, because these days you never know with AI. I don't know. But I am, let's see, everything in my background brought me to the place of communication. Although I will say I work with speakers and I also work with parents because communication is the behavior by which we express our thoughts, ideas, and feelings. And luckily, it is a behavior that can be modified. So my background is in early childhood, human development, psychology, and coaching. And I've been in this arena for 18 plus years, although in my entrepreneurship only for the last 4 or 5 years now, somewhere around there. Can't remember what year it is. Sometimes I can't remember the day either. So, you know, I have to look outside to remember, is it a Monday? And then I realize that's not where I'm going to get the day. So I will say this, when it comes to communication, something that I see across the board, whether you're a CEO or you're a parent or you're really in any role in the world, it is the way in which we show up in the world. And yet, because a lot of us who don't have any communication delays per se, which this is the specific field I come from, when we don't have any specific communication delays or disabilities, we think, oh, I know how to talk, therefore I can communicate. And those are vastly different things. And that's really what I try to do, is help people understand that communication is about a lot more than the words you say.
Yes, talking and communicating are vastly different. I will tell you, I spent an evening last week at an award ceremony for my son and thought, wow, how much more effective would his education have been if his teachers and faculty actually knew how to communicate?
Yes, absolutely.
I also want to mention that Yarona is a fellow international best-selling author as a participant in the Cracking the Rich Code series. I believe you are also in volume 14. Am I right?
Actually, I'm in volume 12.
12.
12.
Okay.
Yes, 12. Yeah. It's hard to keep up these days. So,
It is. It's a large series at this point.
it is with so many incredible humans and so many incredible people doing incredible things in the world. So,
Yes.
yeah.
So let's talk about communications. Now, in your intro, you said, communications is not simply talking.
Right.
How do you characterize what communications actually is?
It is, as I said before, the behavior meaning the actions we take, excuse me, meaning the actions specifically that we take when we're trying to pass along an idea, a thought, or a feeling to somebody else. And that can take a variety of different shapes and forms. We have a vast array of different platforms that we use to communicate with other people these days. In fact, I would say we have an obscene amount of platforms in which we use to communicate with one another these days. And that alone causes issues. In my way of looking at it, I kind of think of it as the Tower of Babel at this point. We have so many different ways of communicating that people are not learning the most effective ways. They're just learning the various platforms. And that's a distinction that requires a little bit more nuance. So I will explain this. When you're texting somebody, how often do you make an assumption about what they said based on how you felt that day or the horrible things that were going on in your life? And you read this text and you're like, what are they talking about? I already told them blah, 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 or this, that, and the other. And then you kind of send something back and suddenly you find yourself in a texting argument. And I've seen this countless times, or an email argument, or, even just DMs argument or LinkedIn posts that go wrong, and all these different places and spaces because people are in the written form of communication. And the written form of communication requires a very particular skill where you're more expressive emotionally with the verbiage you use than you would if you were actually in person. Because when we're in person with people, people can feel our intentions based on our emotional intention. They can feel our intention with the thing we're saying based on the emotions that are coming through in the voices, in our body language, in our facial expression, in our eye contact, in so many things that we call the nonverbal aspects of communication. Even a body positioning, the way you're positioned when you're talking to somebody, has a very specific cue to the person who's listening to you and the person who's receiving your communication. Yet in the written form, we go sideways, and that's because our preconceived ideas, our preconceived experiences, our past experiences that come with us, even if that experience just happened an hour ago, comes with us into what we're reading and the way we're processing what we're reading. So it's very important for us to understand, even the way somebody writes a book is going to be very different from the way somebody writes a speech. Very, very different. But how many of my speakers do I have to get them to understand they're not writing a book, they're writing a script? Very, very, very different. And so it requires us to have the ability to start to understand not just what I call self-editing, which is basically where you're experiencing something. So let's say this is in the written form. You're experiencing that thing. You have to say to yourself, okay, what is the intention this person is trying to drive towards me? And ask yourself that before you start writing something back in response based on, again, what you've just experienced. Because let's say you just had a massive argument with your partner or your colleague or something like that, and you're still feeling the tension from that and the confusion, maybe even. And then you read this thing and you bring that tension and confusion into what you've just read. It's terrible. And we do it all the time. So we have to separate that part of us that says, okay, what I just experienced, what I just, expressed with this other person that led me to these particular feelings is not the same as the conversation I'm about to have now. And a lot of times it requires us to put the best of intentions on the person who's writing it to us. Really, we have to do that. And
Yep.
sometimes we then suss out they did not have the best of intentions. But we kind of have to start with that first. And the same thing is true for the spoken word. We have to start with that until we start to see that the actions that are taking place are not actually in alignment with what the person is saying.
Yes, that's very true. And communications is so nuanced. Even in a face-to-face conversation, the exact same conversation will take on a different meaning if the speaker is standing there in front of you with their arms open as opposed to standing there with arms crossed. And when you're dealing with written communications, and most electronic communications is written, you don't have that tell.
Right. And the vocal varieties. So
Yes.
in linguistics, so the body language and the vocal varieties, which in linguistics we call prosodics and suprasegmentals, are vast. And there's slight nuances that are also culturally different as well. So we have to also understand that sometimes we're dealing with cultural differences that are not being clear and clarified. We also then have what's called semiotic theory in communication. And semiotic theory really goes around the signs and symbols that we've created culturally. So this one is a really cool one. I love this. In semiotic theory, we have what we call symbols and signs, and then there's a whole host of different things. But I love this example. We as a collective species decided that the color red, when you see it in a traffic stop, means stop. Yet red doesn't actually indicate stop in any way, shape, or form. There's no correlation there. There's no connection there. Not like when you see smoke, you make the assumption of fire. Or when you see a signpost that has a tree on it, you understand, or falling trees or falling rocks, you understand there are falling rocks there, or deer crossings or something like that. It's the symbolism that it's being assigned to. But even the word dog, D-O-G, has nothing to do with the animal. There's no correlation or connection there. We've just all collectively agreed that DOG symbolizes dog and that particular animal. So we've actually done this as a civilization and a species, which is why I like to come at it from the human development side of things and where our survival instinct comes in to play, because it really does when we're communicating with people. That if you can get people to see that something is just a symbol that was agreed upon, then you can also get them to change their minds on that symbol. I want to give you an example of this, which I think is wonderful. I have a new client who's coming in, and he said to me when he was thinking about doing a TEDx talk, he said, for me, that red dot, it symbolizes stop. It all ends here. And I said, well, that's really interesting, but maybe you could look at it as it's a pinpoint on a map. It all begins here. Or here's the destination I'm trying to get to start a new destination entirely. And you just have to start to see things from different manners and perspectives. But let's round that back over to this miscommunication that happens. When we have agreed upon things, that's wonderful. But in this day and age, one of the problems we're experiencing in communication is that we're starting to disagree on what symbols mean in our world and what labels mean and what all sorts of things that we're experiencing in our world, what they mean to us as a collective species. We're actually changing all that. And instead, we're looking at it from, you need to know what this means for me. The problem is, as a collective species, that's impossible to do, just like it's impossible to take in the vast amounts of information on the internet. As a species, that's not how we function. We put things into boxes and places, and that helps us survive. And we are trying to rip apart all the boxes and the symbolisms and all of these things and just carve out our own unique individual space, which isn't such a bad thing because we need to have self-agency. That's beautiful. But we also need to have commune. We are a communal species. So we have to figure out how to navigate this together. And it is breaking down in the forms of communication we are now using.
Yes, I love what you're talking about with symbols, because symbols do change meanings. I think the best example that I can think of off the top of my head is the ancient Hindu symbol for origin. This was an incredibly powerful, positive symbol, except it was co opted in the 30s and 40s as the swastika of the Nazi Party. So now it's an incredibly negative symbol. The entire meaning of it changed, not because the symbol itself changed, but because the people who were using it and their actions were completely in the opposite direction of what the original meaning of the symbol was.
Yes, I'm going to give you a perfect example of just what you said. I am a daughter of a Holocaust survivor. And so, of course, for me, yeah,
Right.
it's got a lot of context. However, I went to India to do a speech a couple of years ago, and in their markets, they had the symbol. And I'm like, and at first I go, whoop. My initial response was like, whoa, and then I was like, oh, I'm in India. Okay. And I understood. And I was like, yeah, I don't take any offense here. And I didn't take offense. And that's just it. We are so broken down in our communication skills that people are taking offense left and right and left and right because they're not understanding one another. We are becoming the Tower of Babel and we are breaking down because we're not as a collective agreeing, hey, let's agree about this. But when you want to individualize it, that's okay. Just don't take offense if I understand it to be this and you then understand it to be this. Just explain it to me. Because my intention is not to be offensive to you, but I may do that unintentionally. And I want you to understand I'm trying to come at this from the best of intentions. Yet that's not what you're assuming on me because you're telling me I'm misinterpreting what your sign or symbol or whatever that may be. But I don't know the individual brain. I only know us as a collective.
And that brings up another point. You hear all of the time, oh, that offends me. I'm offended by that. If you have changed the meaning of something so that somebody else's meaning offends you, that's on you, not the rest of the world.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think well, I know because I understand development, the psychology of development, that a part of that has to do with the way we've parented in the last 40, 50, 60 years. We've changed the game, and that has changed the way we've been raised. And it's actually divided us as a species more so than it's brought us together, even as we collectively have a much bigger, broader global scope of the world. And that is, again, it's very problematic. So, something I'm currently working on myself.
So, talk a little bit about that. How has parenting changed, and what is the effect that that's having?
So, okay, for most of our civilization, for most of our human species development, we have actually had what's called an authoritarian model of parenting. Right? I'm the authority, you're beneath me, what I say goes, and that's that. And that's how it's going to be. And then around the 60s, 70s, we started to change that. A lot of people started to become more globally aware that there were other cultures, other designs. So as we started to see that, we started to see the vast differences from the way people were being raised and the way they were growing. And we moved into this phase of we call permissive parenting, which is where the parents started deciding, I don't want to just tell my child no. I don't want to be an authoritarian. I want to become my child's friend. I think if I'm their friend, then they're going to tell me everything and they're going to trust me and they're going to believe me and they're going to this and that and the other. And parents stopped saying no. They stopped providing what we call boundaries, guidelines, and rules to live by. They stopped believing they had any responsibility. See, it's not power over their children, it's responsibility over their children, because those two things get really misconstrued.
Yes.
It's not about having a power over your child. It's about having the responsibility to raise them the right way so that they understand that life has natural boundaries and we all have to live within them if we're planning on living in any given society. So as things moved into this permissive style parenting, a couple of things also started to happen because nothing ever happens in isolation. It's
Of
always
course
affected
not.
by a multitude of things. And by the way, this is in my parenting book, A Little History of Parenting. One of the things that started happening is national and international news headlines, but especially national in the US, started to highlight these terrible news pieces because we realized bad news sells. Okay, bad news sells. So, what was one of those things we highlighted? Kidnappings. We started
Oh,
to highlight kidnappings across the country. And I don't know if you remember this, but I remember this very well. The kids on the milk cartons, the
yes.
the news anchor saying it's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are? Where kids used to go outside and play with one another and just be told to come home before dinner, or when the streetlights turn on.
Yep.
Okay. Now you had parents moving into this place of fear-based parenting. Stranger danger. Don't take candy from a stranger. Don't get into a car from a stranger. Da, 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 all these things. The irony of that was that the numbers
It was
statistically of crime rates were going down, and the likelihood of your child being kidnapped was so unlikely. But for parents, when you magnify any given fear, you magnify it for them and they think it's everywhere.
well, more than that, the information was completely incorrect. I was an auxiliary police officer for a number of years with the NYPD, and stranger danger was one of the worst things that ever came out because, with no exaggeration, I believe the statistic at the time I was on the force was approximately 92% of kidnappings were done by somebody the child knew.
Yeah,
So we started creating this fear with absolutely no benefit.
no
And
benefit.
now you were talking about,
Yeah,
getting more permissive.
right.
Society then stepped in and went, well, no, you can't be that permissive. So where when I was a child, I would be out all day. I would, take the subway in New York, take the bus, go shopping, whatever it was, and be home by dinner. If I had done that with my children, I'd be getting a knock on the door from the Department of Children and Families.
Yes. We had a mom. Actually, there's so many stories I have, but there was this mom who sent her child to the store. Actually, he wanted to walk to the store, which was 2 blocks from their home, and he was 10. And he went to the store, and somebody called the police. And guess what happened? She got arrested for letting her 10-year-old walk to the store where he knew perfectly well where it was and so on. There's many, many, many stories about this
Yes.
because we went to the opposite side. But here's what happened also before that started to take place. As we were promoting the fear and just making it horrible for parents who were afraid of every shadow. And when we knew the reality was the abuse was actually more than likely in the home or from somebody you knew, we were also doing two other things. One in the home was cable TV and video games. And then two in the home were the parents. Now, here's the thing when kids go out and play with each other, they do what we call peer to peer conflict resolution. When you're out playing with your friends and one person wants to play this, and another person wants to play this, and you're like, okay, let's play together. Oh, but I don't want to do that, but I want to do that. You start to have these conversations where you start to get the earliest stages of conflict resolution because you get to see one another's perspectives and say, well, we want to play together, so we've got to make this work. And compromise happens. But when they came into the home, the parents that were there were like, don't bother me, because they didn't want to be bothered. But then the kids were yelling and screaming at each other and arguing and doing all this sort of stuff. And what was happening? The parents were coming in to break it up. And as a result, it was telling the kids, you don't know how to conflict resolve for yourselves. An authority figure is required to do so. And what it did is it pushed them into black and white thinking because it pushed them into, well, my way is the right way. Well, your way is the right way. Well, my way is the right way. And back and forth. And only an authority figure would be able to judge and decide. And that really hurt our children. I cannot stress how much that hurt our children because Gen Z is primarily made up of people who have no ability to conflict resolve because they are in black and white thinking and they're like, you're either on my side or you're on their side, and I don't want to talk to you. Do you know how many Gen Zs I see who are like, no, I'm not. I actually watched this the other day. A Gen Z person had this sign out, but said, "Don't debate me." And then when a person came up to try to talk to them, this person was like, "Debating is stupid. There's no point to it." And that's a lot of their mindset. It's like we can't have disagreements and still as a collective agree to live amongst one another as a communal species. And this is what's really breaking us down because, as you said, then the authoritarian paternalism model of our government started coming in and saying, hey, we got to do something about this. Let's start patrolling more. Let's arrest parents who XYZ. There was a mom who let her two kids play out in her front yard, and a neighbor called the police. And the stranger danger thing, let's go a little deeper there. One of the things about telling kids that stranger danger is bad is also telling them that your community is not safe. Where we used to have neighbors watching out for one another,
Yes.
you know, other parents on that street kind of seeing the kids and keeping eyes on them. We now are so paranoid about that we've actually removed that the access to our neighboring community. And we've pitted neighbors against each other. And it is a horrible, horrible place to be. And honestly, I could go on about that forever, but that's really what I want to primarily say is we need to change the communication and we need to get more vulnerable with one another and start to have these difficult conversations again. And Gen Z, most especially more than anyone else, and millennials too, need to come to the table and be willing to have disagreements, but be able to empathize with each other's sides instead of being this polarized division.
So. Yeah, I think on a, and I'm simplifying this for the, for the sake of the podcast, it's that people actually need to have conversations, not even difficult conversations, just conversations, and understand there is a difference between a conversation and an argument. And for a conversation, you actually have to actively seek common ground. And we're not doing that anymore.
No, we're really not. And the truth is, conversations are never easy, but they are so rewarding because they open up your own blinders that you walk around in life with not even knowing that are on you. We all do it. We all have blinders to many, many things. But when we get to have our blinders not ripped away, but gently removed and have those more subtle conversations, this is where the game starts to change. So one thing that I would advise every human being, when you go to text somebody, don't send a text. Maybe make a phone call. And now I know this is going to be like, oh my God, Gen Z is like, what are you talking about? Nobody calls anymore. We only text. Start maybe with a voice message, because in your voice is where everything is carried, the range of your emotions and the intention that you want to set forth with the person you're speaking with. So just start with a voice message and then go from there and start to have real in-person synchronous conversations, because asynchronous communication, which is in the form of texting, emails, all of those platforms, is also breaking our societies apart. Because there's a lot of misinformation that gets across that. There's also, again, a lot of different perspectives that gets delayed in understanding. But when you're having a conversation, you're in real time with one another, and it's not easy, but man, it opens your eyes when you're willing to let your eyes be opened.
Yeah, I like the willing thing. I mean, as Eric knows very well, I talk about the kindness platform. That's the name of my presentation. And it just assumes, and I love the video on your homepage, by the way, that says we are one, because that's creation. All creation is beautiful and we are one. I always say, think about walking around this world where you can't see, but you can just interact with everybody and see where we're at. So every present moment is an opportunity to lead with kindness. And it gets right back to that. It's easier said than done, but awareness is the key to the whole thing. I know I've talked about this several times. Have you ever heard of the book, The Four Agreements and then the Fifth Agreement?
I have.
Miguel
yes.
Ruiz.
Yep.
And the agreements are so appropriate. And again, they just get back to it. The bottom line is when we're born as a child, you look at my grandchildren, they're just there, they're creation. But then influences take over and so on and so forth. And everybody is their own artist. because you see things different from me and everybody else. So the agreements very, very quickly are number one, be impeccable with your word, which is just be yourself. Number two is don't take anything personally, because again, we're all different. On the same lines, number three is don't make assumptions, because we're all different that way too. But number four, the fourth agreement is always do your best. And then the fifth agreement that they wrote, the book, which reviews the first four, so I would highly recommend doing that. And this is the key in interactions face to face, is be skeptical, which means question everything, but learn to listen. And if you can learn to listen, two of these in one mouth, that's what it's all about. So I mean, life is complicated, and I grew up with a daily newspaper and 3 television stations, so I wasn't bombarded 24/7 with all this negativity that was out there. And if you put things into perspective and realize that you can choose to turn things off and choose to do whatever you want to do, that's where it starts. And I'm sure that you talked about that to parents and stuff like that, and I'm sure that that's a lot of what you portray in that. But I love that video. 750,000 listeners, one powerful message. We are one. That's it.
Yeah, well, I talked more in that one, but the footage wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. So that's the best clip of it.
Yeah, well, it was just like a pow, just looking at it, saying, okay, I would have loved to have.
Yes. Here's the thing, too, and I love what you said about kindness, because human kindness is the biggest strength we have, but we rarely lean on it because of our survival mechanism. Our survival mechanism tells us to fear anything that is different than us. It tells us to, and of course, anything that's different than us is usually things that change in our environment, but also things that look different than us. Unfortunately, we are a species who's created in that way, fear the threats, the potential threats. So be more than skeptical, be actually like suspicious. And that's a problem, because suspicion means that you're assuming bad intent from somebody else. Yet we are a species with this whole, we fear change, and change is the only inevitable thing that life has to offer. So I always say, well, once we stop fearing change, then we can also stop fearing what's different than us. We can also start leaning into that which is different than us with curiosity and an interest in learning and just observing it all. And the listening part, this is the hardest part for people. I had a client of mine go on the TEDx stage that I moderated last weekend. And he talks about how that listening for our turn to speak is what most of us do. But listening to understand requires being, like you said, present. It requires being with that person without the distractions that we tend to have all around us. And in this age of a wealth of distractions, it's quite easy to get distracted. So when you're talking with people, when you're having a conversation, put your phone away. Don't just put it down face down on a table, because let me tell you, it emanates a certain level of distraction even when it's just being visible. Put it away. Put it in your purse, your pocket, wherever you need to do, put it away. Because let me tell you, there's less emergencies than most people realize out there. But we all think we're going to be the exception to the rule. And unfortunately, thinking you're going to be the exception to the rule, that a bad emergency is going to come around the corner, means that you're always in hypervigilance and anxiety. And it doesn't allow you, when you're in hypervigilance and anxiety, it doesn't allow you to be present. Make no assumptions about what comes tomorrow or what even comes in your next breath, because we're not guaranteed any of that stuff. And just be here in the moment with the people that you're with.
Very true. Now, we have just barely scratched the surface of this, so we're going to have you back, because we're just about at the end of our time. So before we wrap up, if our listeners want to get a hold of you, possibly as a TEDx speaking coach, or learn more about your services, how can they do so?
Best thing to do is to either message me through LinkedIn, and my name is pretty unique, so most people will find it, Yarona Boster, YARONA BOSTER. And that's the same for my website, yaronaboster.com. And in my website, you will see the main portion of my website is the speaking stuff, but also as you toggle through, you will find my Footprints coaching website, which is the one that's dedicated to my parenting and loss work.
Fantastic. Chip, what do you think is the big takeaway for our listeners this week?
Well, it all started when I looked at your website and said, "We are one," and everything that you are focusing on, simplification. If we can get back to simplification in the present moment is the simplest form of that. That's so important. And all of the tips and things that you've given us, the history of what has been going on for the last, well, I'm 70 now, all these years, and I went through all of that stuff. It's so important to understand that, but to put it in its place and just get back to the present. And if you can flip a little switch and have something that you can look at and get a moment of positivity whenever you're down, that's one of the keys to doing that. So it's great to meet you and get to know you, and God bless what you're doing. It's awesome.
Thank you, Chip.
Yeah, I think for me, the big takeaway is that we really do need to get back to the basics of communication and communicating with each other, because the ripple effects of that are going to be so profound. It's not simply about getting a message across, it's about how we live, how we relate to other people. And all of that is being hampered by the fact that we're not communicating with each other. We're talking at each other, but we're not listening, and we're not having those conversations, and we really need to. You've been listening to the Success Showcase. You can catch every episode at xvadio.com, the Apple Podcasts app, YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts. Remember, make this your best week ever and make next week even better. We'll see you then.